We're looking at Ruth, the entire book of Ruth, verses chapter 1 through 4. Ruth, chapter 1 through 4. If you have your Bible tonight, I do want you to pull it out because we are going to look at some scriptures tonight. And I'm not going to read everything, but there are a few verses that I want to extract, that I want to highlight to focus our study tonight, because there's so much in the book of Ruth, especially all 4 chapters. So I'm going to do my very best to focus it as best as I can. But I want to start here because I believe that the book of Ruth is just as much about Naomi as it is about Ruth, because Naomi is a critical character in the book of Ruth. And you really can't talk about Ruth if you don't talk about Naomi. So we're going to highlight some things about Naomi as well. So Ruth chapter 1, the chapter opens up by telling us first that Naomi, her husband, Elimelech, Ruth, Oprah, and her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, are in Moab. So the historical context here is that Elimelech and his 2 sons they're Israelites. And so they left Israel, or Bethlehem, to go to Moab because there was a famine in Bethlehem. And once they get to Moab, Naomi's husband dies. Not only does her husband die, but her 2 sons die. About 10 years later, her 2 sons die. And as a result of their death, she decides, and I'm skipping through some things, but as a result of her death, she decides to go back to Bethlehem, to go back to her home where her family is. And in the midst of all of that is happening, she tells Ruth and she tells Oprah to go back home because I have nothing to offer you. I do not have any other sons. And so what is important here is that Naomi has not only lost her husband, but she's lost her sons. But what does that mean? That means that she has lost her security, right? The men during this particular time were those who were responsible for taking care of the women. They had property that was in their name. And in fact, when a husband died, the property and everything that he had did not go to the wife, it went to the son. I don't know about you all, but thank God times have changed. And now husbands can leave, things to their wives. But that's what happened. And so because Naomi's husband is now deceased, and her 2 sons are deceased, she does not have anything. And in the same sense, Ruth and Oprah don't have anything either. And so she tells them, go back home because I have nothing to offer you. I don't have any more sons. And even if I had another son, would you wait until that son is of the age for you to marry them? And so Oprah says, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to give you all the Alicia version. Oprah says, I'm out. Peace. I'm gone. You want me to leave? You have nothing to offer. And that's the reality of it. And she leaves. Ruth makes the decision to stay. And here's where I have questions in the chapter, because as we know, the Bible says that Naomi is a sorrowful woman. In fact, when she goes back to Bethlehem, the people are excited to see her. They said, "Oh my goodness, Naomi, welcome back." And she says, I left here full, but I've come back empty. And she says, don't even call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitterness. She is bitter. She is sorrowful. She is hurting because she has lost her husband. She has lost her sons, and she has lost her security. And so in essence, it seems hopeless for Naomi at this point. And so my question is, what makes Ruth decide to stay with a woman who is bitter, to stay with a woman who has lost everything? What goes on and what makes her decide that I'm going to stay here and I'm going to commit to someone who doesn't even want me to stay with her? In fact, Naomi told her, she said, no, Ruth, go back, go home. And she refused to go. And so the second time, Naomi says, fine, stay. Now, I don't know why Ruth stayed. The Bible does not tell us why she stayed. It could have been because Ruth did not have maybe a family to go back to. Maybe she didn't have a good relationship with her family. It could be that she felt the same way that Naomi felt. She had lost her husband. She was grieving. She was sorrowful. She was sad. Or it could have been that Ruth understood what it meant to be a widow. And I want to point out here that God shares in his word, or tells us in his word, that he cares about widows. In James 1:26, he says, pure religion and undefiled before the Father is this, that you visit the fatherless and the widow in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. God cared so much about widows that he actually placed this rule in place, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in Deuteronomy, where if a woman lost her husband, if her husband died, the brother of her husband was to marry her so that the legacy could continue. It was a part of the Israel law to take care of that widow. It was his responsibility. The brother of the deceased husband was to marry that woman to take care of her. And so Ruth, the first point I want to make here, as we're talking about Ruth, is that Ruth is committed. She makes a decision, and then she commits to that decision. And we're very familiar with it. She tells Naomi, where you go, I'll go. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. She makes a decision to stay with her, and then she makes a commitment to Naomi. And so when we talk about in the context of sisterhood, in the context of relationships, and what makes a successful relationship, what makes a successful sisterhood, the first is the decision to be committed to that sister, to be committed to that friend, even when they don't want you as a friend. Because Naomi told her, again, she told her to leave, but Ruth decided to stay. She made the decision to stay, because there are sometimes people will come into your life to be a blessing. And then there are other times when you come into someone's life to be a blessing. And so we see here that Ruth is a blessing to Naomi, but we're going to find out later that Naomi was also a blessing to Ruth. So there's this element of reciprocity. You know, I tell people, you don't get in relationships with people because you anticipate that if I do this for you, you'll do that for me. But that's just how it happens. If you're there for me, I'm there for you. If you support me, I support you. And so we see here that Ruth makes the commitment to be loyal to Naomi and to do what Naomi asked her to do. I want to point out, second, the distinction here between the Moabites and the Israelites. It is significant that Ruth says, your people will be my people and your God will be my God, because she is a Moabite. Right. And Moabites were, the Bible calls them a pagan nation, which just simply means that they did not worship or serve God. And in fact, they had a hostile attitude toward Israel. They were a part of the group who were standing in the way of the children of Israel to get their promised land. So when Ruth says that your people will be my people, your God will be my God, she's saying, listen, I'm an Israelite now. I know I'm a Moabite, but I'm making the conscious decision to serve your God. And we'll find the significance of that a little bit later. Let's go to chapter 2. In chapter 2 in Ruth, chapter 2, verse 3 through 11, let me set the stage here. Ruth and Naomi have left Moab, and now they are in Bethlehem. When they get there, Ruth takes the initiative to get food for them. Naomi does not tell her to do that. She takes the initiative, which we see in verse 2. She takes the initiative to do that. So I'm going to read let's go to Ruth chapter 2. Verse 2 says, one day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, this is a New Living Translation, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in the field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. So Ruth did not know that she was going to end up on Boaz's field. That's just where she was. But she made the decision to go out and to glean grains. And this is significant because what happened was they would gather the grain, but it would also be collected so that they could then turn it into food. And as she's there, she realizes that Boaz, who is the owner, is also a relative of Naomi's husband. So point number one, we see that Ruth is committed. Point number two, Ruth is hardworking. She's hardworking. Verse 4, chapter 2, verse 4. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, the harvesters replied. Verse 5, then Boaz asked his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she is a young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter. Verse 8, Boaz went over and said to her, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other field. Stay right behind the young men working in the field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. And so we see here that Ruth is a hard-working woman. And while she is working, minding her business, taking care of her mother-in-law, Boaz sees her. I think everyone on the line is married tonight. I'm the only single one, so I'll speak to myself. Praise God. Oftentimes, and I have nothing against people who say to put yourself in a position to be seen. I have nothing against that. But Ruth has not put herself in a position to be seen, right? She is working to take care of her mother-in-law. And as she is working, as she is doing what she can for this widow woman, he sees her. And he stops and he asks the question, who is that? And as he's asking her, listen, he finds out what she's doing. He says, I've heard about what you've done. She's out here working hard to take care of her mother-in-law, Naomi. Point number 3, Ruth has a good reputation. Ruth has a good reputation. Ruth chapter 2, verse 11, New Living Translation. Listen to what it says. Boaz says, yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of her husband. I have heard how you left your father and your mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. So the question tonight is, what is your reputation? Ruth has a good reputation, which means that somebody is watching her. Somebody is watching her. And just as somebody is watching her, somebody's watching us. Your reputation is formed by people who watch you. It could be work, it could be church, it could be in your community. And your reputation is formed by your consistency, by how consistent you are, no matter where you are, that your character remains the same, no matter where you are. And so Ruth is working hard. She's doing all that she can to tend for her family. And now she has a reputation. Her reputation is of showing kindness and generosity to others. And because of her kindness, because of her generosity, she finds favor. She finds favor not just with anyone, but she finds favor with the owner of the land. She finds favor with Boaz. And he says to her, whatever you want, we're going to make it easy for you. You can have it. As those who used to harvest, they would leave grains on the side so the poor could come and gather, or those who were marginalized could come and then gather grain and take it back. And so he tells her, I want you to follow close by these men. So as the leftovers drop, you have the first choice of what you want. When you want to rest, you rest, right? But he gives her favor and he shows her kindness because of her reputation. Let's go to chapter 3. Chapter 3, in this chapter, Naomi comes up with a plan to seek security and a potential future for Ruth. Notice what she does. She instructs Ruth to approach Boaz, who who Naomi knows is the kinsman redeemer. And she tells him to approach him in the middle of the night when he's sleeping on the threshing floor. Now, a few things. First, what is a kinsman redeemer? Right? That was a relative who volunteered to take responsibility for the extended family. Remember, we were talking about God's law of how the nearest relative of the dead husband was to marry the widow. And that's in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 through 10. That the next relative, or the relative that was closest to the deceased husband, had to marry the widow to take care of her, right? To restore her, to ensure that she had everything that she needed. And so Naomi had no relatives in Moab. And she did not know if any of her relatives were alive in Bethlehem until she got there. And so what this law did, it kept the widow from poverty, and it provided a way for the family name of the dead husband to continue. And so Naomi knows this. She knows this law. And so she tells Ruth what to do so that Boaz will be her kinsman redeemer. She instructs her to approach Boaz in the middle of the night while he's sleeping on the threshing floor. Now, this does not suggest anything sexual or seductive. Okay. She was instructing Ruth to act in accordance with the Israel custom and law. Now, remember, Ruth is a Moabite. So she is not aware of the Israel custom and laws. So to Ruth, it might seem strange, or it might seem odd that Naomi wants her to do this. Here's my fourth point. Ruth follows instructions. Ruth follows instructions. She did what Naomi told her to do, even though it may have seemed awkward, even though she may not have been aware of the Israel custom or the Israel law. She followed instructions to the T. Naomi told her what to do. She told her how to look when you do it. She told her to dress herself up, oil herself up. I don't know if they had that baby oil, y'all know what I'm talking about, that cocoa butter. But I can imagine that's what she put on. She oiled herself up, because that's what Naomi told her to do. You said, you go in, you look beautiful, and then you lay at his feet, because that was the custom law. And so by doing this, Ruth was instructing Boaz, watch this, without ever explicitly saying it. Her actions were instructing him that he could be her kinsman redeemer, or that he could find someone to marry her. That says to me, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, that this was about business, not romance. I know people say, I'm waiting for my Boaz to come and find me and sweep me off my feet. But I'm reading in the text, and this does not look like a scenario that society paints, where Boaz has come in and just swept Ruth off of her feet. She is doing what has been instructed because she is trying to secure her family. She's trying to gain security for her family. Boaz, if I could use the 21st century vernacular, Boaz does not shoot his shot. He is not sliding into her DMs. Okay. He is sleeping. And he wakes up and Ruth is there. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is not a wonderful story, because it is, because even though it may not be the quintessential story of romance, it is the quintessential story of a redeemer. He may not have come in and swept her off her feet, but he saved the day. He saved her family. He saved her legacy. And that's what he did, right? Which some might argue is more important than sliding into a DM. Save me, retire me, sit me down. And that is in essence what Boaz does, right? He saves her and he redeems her family. He is a man who acts in honor, respect, and kindness. He really didn't have much really to gain from this experience, because we'll find out in chapter 4 that by giving Ruth a child, that was Naomi's heir, not his. But because he's an honorable man, because he extended kindness to Ruth, right, we honor Boaz for what he did. So in Ruth chapter 3, verse 7 through 8, Ruth follows the instructions of Naomi. Ruth chapter 3, let's go to verse 7. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. After midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up and turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. She said, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." Boaz wakes up. He is surprised to see her at his feet. But what he does do is he receives her well because of her reputation. Listen to verse 10. He said, "The Lord bless you, my daughter." Boaz exclaimed, you are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before. For you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor." He honors Ruth for what she has done. Even though he's surprised to see her, he receives her well because of her reputation. And so he listens to her request and he promises to take the necessary steps to fulfill the role of the kinsman redeemer. And that leads us into Ruth chapter 4. In Ruth chapter 4, Boaz promises her that he will do what he needs to do, to see that her family is redeemed. But he realizes that there is another relative that is closer to Naomi's deceased husband than he is. And so he has to give this man an opportunity to marry Ruth. And so he goes to him, and we see that something is introduced new in the chapter here, in verse number 3. When Boaz goes to this man, he tells him, the first thing he says is that there is some property that Elimelech has that you can purchase. And the man agrees to purchase this land. And then Boaz says, but there's a caveat here. If you purchase this land, you also have to marry Ruth. And the man immediately says, no, thanks. I don't want the property anymore. And here's why he says it. He says, because I don't want any problems when I die, leaving this to my children, right? In essence, I don't want anything that could potentially be messy. So I prefer not to do this. And so as a result of this relative not wanting to marry Ruth, Boaz steps in and he decides to marry Ruth. He openly announces that his intention is to marry Ruth. And so they are married and they have a son named Obed. This is my last point. Point number 5. Ruth's life had a larger purpose. Ruth's life had a larger purpose. The child Obed would later be the ancestor of David and Jesus. And so now this woman who is a Moabite, who is not even an Israelite, is the grandmother of David. She is an essential component into the lineage of Jesus. The story started as sorrow, as grief, as hurt, but it ends in this great blessing that she probably could have never imagined, all because she made a decision to commit to Naomi. I believe that God honors relationships. I believe that it is God's intention that we be in relationship with other people. This is two is better than one, for one fall, the other can pick him up. Where there is unity, there is strength. One can chase 1,000, two can put 10,000 to flight. And I believe that when we are committed, when we are loyal to one another, when we are faithful to one another, that God will honor that and he will honor us. The last point that I will make, if you notice that God is not really mentioned extensively in this book, but yet he is at the center of it. It seems that things are a coincidence, but nothing is by happenstance. Nothing is by accident. He is interwoven into every aspect of the book of Ruth. And because of Ruth's loyalty, because of her kindness, because of her commitment, because of her decision, she's able to take her rightful place as a woman who was essential in the lineage of Jesus.